It is genuinely difficult to overstate just how humiliating this week has been for the Trump administration's Department of Education. I mean, we are watching a level of legal incompetence that would be funny if it weren't dealing with the lives of traumatized children. But here we are. The headline you need to see, the one that should be plastered across every single cable news ticker right now, is that the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals didn't just reject Donald Trump's attempt to block mental health funding for schools, they laughed it out of the room. They looked at the administration's emergency, and I use the word emergency with the heaviest air quotes imaginable, and essentially said, "Go home, you have no case, cut the checks." Let's just pause and sit with the reality of what just happened. This wasn't a close call. This wasn't a split decision on a complex constitutional question. This was a 3-judge panel looking at the Department of Education's desperate attempt to stop $1 billion from going to high-need school districts and telling them that their arguments were legally hollow. And what was the emergency they were so panicked about? What was the terrifying threat that required the Department of Justice to rush to an appeals court in the middle of the night? Was it fraud? Was it embezzlement? No, the emergency was that schools in rural America, schools in underserved communities, schools that have been begging for help since Uvalde, were about to receive money to hire counselors. That's it. That is the villain in their story. A social worker in Madera County, California, a psychologist in rural Connecticut. The Trump administration argued that releasing this money would cause them irreparable harm. Think about that phrase, irreparable harm. They went before a federal judge and argued that if they were forced to help children process trauma, the government would be injured beyond repair. And the court looked at that and said, effectively, you are out of your minds. But here is where the story shifts from evil to just plain pathetic. Because the reason they lost, the reason they are now being forced to release millions of dollars immediately, isn't just because their ideology is cruel. It's because they are lazy. We have the receipts on this. Judge Kimberly Evanson in the lower court didn't just rule against them, she embarrassed them. She pointed out that when the Trump administration tried to cancel these grants, they didn't do an analysis, they didn't review the individual contracts, they sent out what was essentially a copy-paste form letter to hundreds of districts. They treated a $1 billion congressional appropriation like it was a subscription to a magazine they wanted to cancel. And this is the part that drives me absolutely insane. You have Linda McMahon, you have these so-called experts running the Department of Education claiming they are there to fix the bureaucracy. They claim they are the savvy business people who are going to bring efficiency to government. And yet, they cannot even draft a legal termination letter that survives first contact with a district judge. They were found to be arbitrary and capricious. For those who don't speak lawyer, arbitrary and capricious is the judicial equivalent of saying, you made this up on a napkin 5 minutes ago. So now because of their arrogance and because of their laziness, the dam has broken. The stay is denied, the checks are going out, millions of dollars are flowing back into Marion County, back into Yukon, back into the communities that actually need it. Trump tried to play tough guy with school counselors, and he just got smacked down by the Ninth Circuit.
And honestly, it's perfect because it exposes the central lie of this entire administration. They aren't legal masterminds playing 4D chess. They're vandals who don't know how to read the instruction manual. They tried to break the system, and the system just broke them. But don't think for a second that this incompetence makes them less dangerous. It just makes them more desperate. And that is exactly what we need to talk about next. But let's pop the hood on this, because if you think the headline is bad, the details are actually worse. This isn't just about a court ruling. It is about these specific, verifiable lies the Trump administration told to try and justify this cruelty. Let's start with a primary argument. When the Department of Education sent out termination notices to these schools back in April 2025, they didn't say, we found fraud. They didn't say, the program isn't working. They claimed that these grants explicitly designed to prevent school shootings, were actually secret vehicles for divisive ideologies and race-ace recruiting quotas. That was the line. That was the talking point blasted out on social media by their surrogates. They told you that this money was being used to indoctrinate your children. But let's look at the receipts. What actually happens with this money? In Madera County, California, this divisive ideology funding was restoring $3.8 million to hire school psychologists for a district that is chronically understaffed. In rural Maine, 9 school districts were using these grants to retain 14 mental health professionals, people who are often the only resource for a suicidal teenager in a 100-mile radius. In Connecticut, the University of Connecticut was using a $3 million grant to train 25 graduate students to work specifically in Hartford's highest need schools.
So when the Trump administration says they are fighting DEI, what they are actually doing is firing the only grief counselor in a rural high school. They are taking a program designed to catch kids before they crack and labeling it woke because it prioritizes hiring people who actually live in the communities they serve. And here is the smoking gun that the courts found, the piece of evidence that absolutely destroyed the government's case. When Judge Evanson looked at how the administration canceled these grants, she found that they hadn't even bothered to read the individual applications. On April 29th, the Department of Education sent out identical termination letters to hundreds of grantees. It was a mass email, a boilerplate rejection. Think about the arrogance of that. They didn't look at whether a specific school in Ohio was doing a good job. They didn't check if a district in Nevada had reduced its suicide rate. They just hit select all and delete. This is why the judge ruled their actions were arbitrary and capricious. Under the Administrative Procedure Act, you are allowed to change policy, but you are not allowed to be incoherent. You cannot sign a contract with a school district, let them hire staff, let them start treating kids, and then pull the rug out from under them 6 months later with zero explanation other than, we don't like the vibe. And let's be crystal clear about where this money came from. This wasn't some slush fund created by a radical leftist think tank. These grants were born out of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act of 2022. Do you remember why that law was passed? Do you remember the horror we all felt watching the news from Uvalde? 19 children and 2 teachers were slaughtered in their classrooms, and in the wake of that nightmare, Republicans and Democrats, people like John Cornyn and Chris Murphy, actually sat down and said, we disagree on guns, but we can all agree that we need more mental health support in schools.
They shook hands on it, Congress appropriated the money, the president signed it. It was a promise made to the parents of dead children that we would try to do better. And what did Donald Trump and Linda McMahon do? They looked at that promise, a promise written in the blood of 4th graders, and they decided it was less important than their culture war. They decided that scoring points against DEI was worth gutting the very programs designed to stop the next Uvalde. When the Department of Justice stood up in court and argued that the government would suffer irreparable harm if they had to keep paying these grants, they were telling us exactly who they are. To them, the harm isn't a child with no one to talk to. The harm isn't a school district in chaos. To them, the harm is simply the fact that they were forced to help people they don't like. And the Ninth Circuit saw right through it. They saw a Department of Education that is so obsessed with dismantling itself that it has forgotten how to function legally. But this isn't just an isolated incident of incompetence. If you zoom out, you realize this is part of a much larger, much darker pattern. But if you think this ends with a single court order, or if you think this is just about one specific grant program in the Department of Education, you are missing the forest for the trees. Because when you step back, when you actually zoom out and look at the architecture of what is happening right now, you realize that this isn't an accident. This isn't a glitch. This is the operating system. We are watching a systematic, deliberate strategy of governance by sabotage. And to understand why they were willing to go to the mat to cut funding for traumatized children, you have to understand the philosophy driving the people currently occupying the executive branch. Let's look at the person leading the charge, Secretary of Education Linda McMahon. Now, I have said this before, and I will say it again. Linda McMahon was not hired because she has deep pedagogical expertise. She wasn't hired because she has a lifelong passion for curriculum development or special education funding. She was hired for one reason and one reason only, because she promised to be a wrecking ball. This is the Project 2025 playbook in action, plain and simple. The stated goal, the goal they scream about at rallies, is to dismantle the Department of Education. But you can't just snap your fingers and delete a federal agency. It's complicated. It requires Congress. It requires laws. So what do you do instead? You break it from the inside. You make it dysfunctional. You create so much chaos, so much legal liability, and so much gridlock that the agency simply ceases to function. The attempt to cancel these mental health grants fits that pattern perfectly. It is sabotage by neglect. They knew that canceling these contracts without a valid reason was illegal. Their own lawyers probably told them it was illegal, but they did it anyway. Why? Because the cruelty sends a message, and the chaos serves the goal. Even if they lose in court, which they just did, they have managed to freeze funding for months. They have created uncertainty. They have made superintendents across the country terrified to apply for future federal grants because they don't know if the rug will be pulled out from under them next year. This is exactly what they did to the State Department in the first term. This is what they tried to do to the EPA. You hollow out the expertise, you fire the professionals, and you replace clear guidelines with vague, terrifying culture war mandates.
And let's talk about that mandate. Let's talk about how they are weaponizing the word DEI, because this is the skeleton key they are using to unlock and destroy every single public good that they don't like. Notice the evolution here. 5 years ago, the right-wing outrage machine told us that DEI meant critical race theory in law schools. Then it meant diversity seminars in Fortune 500 companies. But now, according to the Trump Department of Justice, DEI includes suicide prevention for fourth graders. Do you see how the definition keeps expanding? It is a blob that consumes everything. If a program helps poor kids, that's equity, so it's bad. If a program hires social workers who speak Spanish in a district that is 40% Hispanic, that's race-based hiring, so it's illegal. They have taken a term that was supposed to be about fairness and turned it into a weapon to strip mine the safety net. They are arguing in federal court that it is better for a school to have 0 counselors than to have a hiring process that encourages diversity. They would rather burn the village down than let anyone they disapprove of hold a water bucket. And the irony, that tragic, bitter irony, is who actually gets burned. We need to talk about the geography of this betrayal, because the Trump administration loves to wrap itself in the flag and claim it speaks for the forgotten men and women of rural America. They claim to represent the heartland. But look at where these grants were going. The Bipartisan Safer Communities Act wasn't sending money to coastal elites. It was sending money to places like rural Maine. It was sending money to Appalachia. It was sending money to districts where the opioid crisis has decimated families, leaving schools as the only stable institution in a child's life.
These are the exact voters Trump claims to love, and yet the moment he got back into power, his administration looked at those communities that are struggling with record rates of teen depression and suicide, and said, "We are cutting your lifeline." Why? Because for this administration, ideology matters more than their own constituents. They are willing to sacrifice the well-being of red state rural districts just to score a point on Fox News about fighting wokeness. It is a betrayal of the highest order. It is a scam. They look these voters in the eye, promise to fight for them, and then quietly slash the budget for the only mental health professional their child will ever see. And this connects to a constitutional danger that is even bigger than education. What we are seeing here is a revival of the impoundment battle. For those who don't spend their weekends reading Nixon-era history, impoundment is when the president simply refuses to spend money that Congress has legally appropriated. Richard Nixon tried this. He tried to act like a king, deciding which laws he would fund and which he would ignore. The courts and Congress smacked him down and passed the Impoundment Control Act of 1974. Donald Trump has explicitly said he wants to bring this power back. He believes that if he is president, he is the Appropriations Committee. He is the law. When his administration tried to withhold this school safety money, that was a test run. It was a probe. They were testing the fences to see if their judiciary would let them get away with ignoring a congressional mandate. Think about the implications of that. If the Ninth Circuit had ruled the other way, if they had allowed Trump to block these funds, it would have established a precedent that the president can effectively veto any law he doesn't like simply by refusing to write the check. It would have ended the separation of powers as we know it.
So when Judge Evanson ruled that their actions were arbitrary and capricious, she wasn't just saving a few grants. She was upholding the basic constitutional principle that Congress holds the purse strings, not the king. But do not mistake this loss for a surrender. The fact that they tried it, the fact that they were willing to use traumatized school children as pawns in a constitutional power grab, tells you everything you need to know about their morality. There is no bottom. There is no line they won't cross. They tried to spin this as a battle against radical leftism. It wasn't. It was a battle against the rule of law. It was a battle against the idea that the government has a responsibility to care for its most vulnerable citizens. And while they lost this round, look at the damage they caused just by trying. Look at the chaos. Look at the schools that hesitated to hire someone because they were scared the funding would vanish. That fear is the point. They want the system to feel unstable. They want you to believe that nothing is guaranteed, that no contract is safe, and that the only thing that matters is the whim of the leader. This is not how a democracy functions. This is how a mafia protection racket functions. Nice school district you have there. Shame if something happened to your funding. And that brings us to the terrifying question of what happens next. Because if they are willing to go this far to block mental health counselors, what are they going to do when the stakes are even higher? What happens when they turn this same arbitrary and capricious weapon against healthcare, against disaster relief, against your social security? Because make no mistake, this was not a one-off. This was a dress rehearsal. And unless we understand exactly where this road leads, we are going to be sleepwalking into a catastrophe that makes this grant dispute look like a playground argument.
So where does this leave us? We can take a victory lap today. We can celebrate the fact that the Ninth Circuit held the line. We can feel a sense of relief that the checks are going out and that the counselors are being hired. But if you walk away from this video thinking, well, the system worked, everything is fine, then you are playing right into their hands. Because the most terrifying part of the story isn't that they tried to cut the funding, it's how they reacted when they got caught. Did you see an apology? Did you see the Department of Education say, we made a procedural error, we will fix it? No, you saw them double down. You saw them attack the judges. You saw them frame the very concept of mental health support as a conspiracy against their voters. This tells us that they are not chastened by this loss. They are merely delayed. And this is the warning I need to drill into your head right now. They are going to learn from this. The next time they try to gut a program that protects vulnerable people, they won't send a lazy copy-paste email. They won't make the arbitrary and capricious mistake again. They will hire smarter lawyers. They will write better termination letters. They will manufacture the rational basis they need to survive a court challenge. We are currently in the testing phase of authoritarian governance. They are throwing things at the wall to see what sticks, and more importantly, to see where the cracks in the judiciary are. Today, the Ninth Circuit held. But what happens when they shop for a different judge in a different circuit? What happens when they appeal this to a Supreme Court that has already shown it is willing to rewrite the rules of administrative law? If we treat this as a one-off scandal, we are missing the trajectory of the bullet.
Think about the precedent they just tried to set. They established that, in their view, the political preferences of the president override the safety of American children. That is the new baseline. So ask yourself, what is the next target? If they are willing to withhold mental health funding because they think diversity is scary, what stops them from withholding disaster relief from a blue state after a hurricane? We've already seen hints of this. Why should we send FEMA money to California? They have sanctuary cities. What stops them from withholding healthcare funding for specific diseases they deem moral failings? What stops them from withholding infrastructure grants to cities that don't vote for them? Once you accept the premise that federal funding is a reward for loyalty rather than a mandate of law, the United States ceases to be a republic.
It becomes a patronage system. It becomes a place where your taxes only benefit you if you bend the knee to the leader. And this brings us to the psychological war they are waging against us. The goal of dragging this fight out, the goal of making these schools sue for their own money is exhaustion. They want you tired. They want the school superintendents to say, you know what, it's not worth the hassle. We just want to apply for the federal grant next time. We'll just go without the counselor. That is how they win, not by banning the program explicitly, but by making the process of accessing it so painful, so legally treacherous, and so politically toxic that good people just give up. It is a war of attrition against the public sector. But here's the thing, we cannot afford to be tired. We look at Uvalde. We look at the faces of those parents who scream their lungs out for change. We look at the teenagers in this country who are reporting record levels of hopelessness. And we have to decide right now, are we going to let the cynics win?
Are we going to let a group of political operatives who have never stepped foot in a public school classroom tell us that caring for a child's mental health is woke? No, absolutely not. This court ruling proves that resistance is not futile. It proves that facts still matter. It proves that when you have the receipts and when you have the courage to stand up and say no, you can actually stop them. The 16 attorneys general who sued, they didn't just accept the termination letters. They fought back. The school districts, they didn't fold. They fought back. That is the lesson. Vigilance is the only currency that matters now. We have to watch them like hawks. Every time they try to delay a payment, every time they try to rewrite a regulation in the dark, every time they try to slander a civil servant, we have to be there. We have to be the ones pointing the camera at them and saying, we see what you are doing. This isn't just about politics anymore. It's about basic human decency. There is a social contract in this country that says we protect the kids first. We don't use them as leverage. We don't use them as props in a culture war. The Trump administration tried to shred that contract this week. The courts pasted it back together. But the glue is wet, and the people holding the scissors are still in the building. So stay angry, stay focused, and do not let them gaslight you into thinking that cruelty is just a policy difference. It's not. It's a choice. And as long as they keep making that choice, we are going to keep dragging them into the light. Make no mistake, we won the battle. But the war for the soul of this country, that is just getting started. I'm Ethan Cole, and if you're not worried, you're not paying attention.